This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Our bold leader today lives by the mantra that doing good is good for business. He is a Harvard MBA graduate, a West Point Academy graduate, and went from the battlefields of Vietnam to global boardrooms. He is the former chair and chief executive officer of MTV Networks International, who built and scaled a global business with a 2 billion audience, 200 channels in 200 countries. He is a successful author of What Makes Business Rock, a former UN ambassador, and former vice chair of Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, as well as COVAX, an initiative to spread the COVID-19 vaccine worldwide. An American by birth, he joins us from his beautiful home in London, the dedicated, disciplined, diplomatic, and development-focused William or Bill Roedy. Welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Bill Roedy, what a great joy to have you as part of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining in and meeting with me today.
Not at all, Anne. A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You know, you've had a remarkable, colorful career. I think you frame it as the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. Could you maybe just sketch for us what is the common thread? What did each of those chapters mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question because as I was living in it, I didn't necessarily see a common thread. But the initial D was defense. I served in Vietnam. I volunteered to go to Vietnam when it was quite unpopular to do that. But as a graduate of West Point, I thought that was my duty. And of course, West Point teaches you so much of what I did not have, which is time management, discipline, leadership, etc.
Yeah.
And then from the Vietnam experience, I pivoted to something much bigger, which was nuclear missile bases as part of NATO. So that's the first D. And again, discipline is a major thread there. And then on to diplomacy. I put diplomacy in the same bucket as my media career, which stretched over 33 years, initially HBO, primarily domestically in the US. And then the bulk of the 33 years, almost a quarter of a century, was spent taking MTV and Nickelodeon and comedy around the world, launching 200 channels in front of a potential audience of 2 billion people and 200 countries. So it was quite extensive. And
that's remarkable. I mean, you founded that and you built that global operation, right?
Yeah, I joined MTV after it started. It started in 81,
yes.
But I took it outside America. That was my whole thing, running it outside. Yeah. And we became quite big. We actually had 80%, for example, of the viewership of MTV. 80% was from outside the US, which is always a bit of a surprise when I mention that to others. While I was at MTV in media around the world, I realized how important, it's a very big part of my strategy, to do something good. And I coined a phrase, doing good is good for business. And that brought me into development. So when I left, this is the third leg to the stool, if you will, of the career, I went all in on not only development, but global health. And I took on roles with Gavi, which is vaccines, AmFAR, which is searching for a cure to AIDS, and 8 to 10 other initiatives. Started something called the Global Business Coalition, which unites business. I worked for 2 secretary generals, So that became all in, if you will, for the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's remarkable. And in terms of the common thread, what do you think that common thread is?
Well, I'm going to preface this by saying that I was asked all the time when I was at MTV about my military background. And I didn't actually talk about my military background because I figured, in the world of rock and roll, who wants to know about combat or even worse, nuclear weapons? So I really didn't talk too much about it. And I wasn't smart enough to realize that I took a lot of what I learned from West Point and at my military experience to the design of a media organization around the world. Small fighting units, keeping communication lines open, knowing your audience very, very well.
Yes.
And I think the common thread there was leadership. And it's easy to describe what the leadership traits should be, but it's much harder in actually doing them. And I don't consider myself a natural leader, but because I've done so much research and I've been trained, I know what the traits are. So the key is to discipline yourself to try and do as many of those traits as possible. So I think that's a common thread. Also, another common thread is scale. I realized early on, impact is really important in this world. And to have impact, you have to have scale. And that's what the vaccines at Gavi were all about. And I found that when I launched 200 channels around the world, that gave us scale. So even though I wasn't smart enough to realize a lot of these common threads, organizational, leadership, strategic scale, I look back on it and those were the common threads.
That's interesting, Bill. I'm curious with that background. I also know you serve on the board of Berlin's creative leadership organization. In your mind, what is the definition of leadership? And following on from that, what do you think are the big leadership challenges today?
Yeah, well, that's a big question.
It is a big question. I know. It's
in the spirit of MTV, I'll try and keep it short. In my latest book, I've identified 20 different traits to leadership. And, you could pick maybe, 4 or 5 that are probably the most important. I would start with your core.
Yes.
Your core character. Emotional compassion is a big part of it.
Yeah.
And then you go from that core to character and integrity to, pick so many of them. A vision, ability to communicate, stamina becomes very important, which means duration. And a lot of people today just simply have all the traits, but they don't have the stamina to do it. Courage to act, being adaptive is really key because we live in acceleration of time now that requires adaptation. Nothing survives the first battle, so no strategy. So you have to adapt right away. That's just one example.
Yeah.
So those are just a few of the examples, Anne, but there's so many.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is pick and choose,
Mm-hmm.
follow what you're good at, perhaps in those, in my case, 20 different leadership traits. But the most important thing is wake up every morning and actually do it.
Absolutely.
Don't talk about it.
So in this world of work, you have this incredible experience working with countries around the world, working with the United Nations, etc. There are so many big issues. If you had to think of perhaps the 2 or 3 that really keep you concerned and troubled, or stuff you mull over a lot, what are the 2 or 3 big issues that you think are facing leaders today?
Yeah, I think they're ones that we all know about are so pervasive. War is number one. We're living every day with this terrible Ukrainian situation. We just came from a terrible 2 years of pandemic, which was widely predicted, but not appropriately prepared for. Climate change. So I would put those in the top 3, of course. There's many subsets of them. And the world has suffered terribly in the last 3 years. Economic is another situation that looks like it's going to be a lot of hardship for a lot of people going forward, driven largely not only by COVID, but also by war and by climate change. And when you think about it, so much rests on economic. It includes food security. It includes getting a handle on inflation, shelter, So I would include economic, and probably those are the top four that cause quite a bit of concern going forward.
And, in this very different kind of world and the demands today, Bill, you authored a CNBC best-selling book, What Makes Business Rock. What do you think the role is for business in terms of dealing with these bigger issues? And how do you motivate business to come to that party?
I had an epiphany several years ago that was basically wrapped around the private sector can have even bigger impact sometimes than governments. Governments have bigger budgets, of course, but in many respects, our political leaders, perhaps more recently, haven't met the expectations of what the people should deserve.
Yeah.
Private sector leaders, they're not saints either, of course, but the impact of the private sector can be quite extensive. And I think the private sector, for example, does things very efficiently. They know how to sell better than anybody. They know how to market. They have distribution systems. They have motivations now. The other epiphany is that at MTV, we started something that I would say was the early seeds of CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
And now it's a must. Now it's a must. Every business must have part of their DNA, an ESG program, something to do with social responsibility. It can be anything, but it has to be something. And I think over time, we're going to continue to see much more impact in this, particularly with anything to do with ESG. There are funds that are set up for ESG. There are departments of hundreds of people now in corporations that are devoted completely to ESG and social responsibility. So this has been a change in the last, I think, 10 years, probably started 20 years ago. And I think it's a very important change because business has so much to offer in solving a lot of these problems that we're talking about.
And dealing with issues of ESG, the environmental, social, and governance aspects, what's in it for business? How do you motivate business to, in your experience, Bill? I mean, do you have a particular example where you've had an organization, a corporate, that was a little skeptical when they have to deliver to not only shareholders, but multiple stakeholders, but really have a kind of a shareholder mentality? How have you persuaded them? Do you have an example of that?
Well, I'll give you starting like 20 years ago. I think it still resonates a bit. So we'll pick a company like, I don't know, Coca-Cola, colored water. So you start with a product that is omnipresent, but may not offer anything good. So Coca-Cola, therefore, pivoted to everything from clean water to all sorts of different initiatives. When I was working with them 20 years ago, they were literally dozens and even in the hundreds of initiatives they supported. One of the ones I liked the best was clean water in Africa where you did not have clean water. Yeah. But anyway, this is the way I would put it, that I think it still holds a bit. So you pick a company like Coca-Cola and AIDS in Africa. I want to fight the AIDS pandemic in Africa because you want your customers to be healthy so they can use your product. Secondly, if you don't believe that, you want to have something that has your employees rally around the flag and feel good about coming in the office, that they're actually doing something good in addition to the commercial aspect of your product. I would say to businesses, because you're quite right, particularly 20 years ago, but even now there's skepticism and reluctance because it may not hit the P&L. And here was always the clincher. If you don't believe in that, taking care of your customers or taking care of your employees, giving them more motivation, do it for your brand. So who cares what you can be a little bit cynical about this, but who cares what the altruism is, what the motivation is, as long as you do something. Yeah. And if you're doing something good for the brand, you are what you do.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily what you think. So a lot of companies actually, that resonated with a lot of companies. And to this day, if you do some things that are, and there's so many examples, MAC Cosmetics, for example, people will buy your brand or be more loyal to your brand. I'm not saying everybody will, but a good number will, if you're doing something good. Yes. And I coined the phrase, doing good is good for business.
Yeah.
So it's an old example, Anne, but I think it still works.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in your wonderful book, what was the key message?
My book.
I mean, what was the key message you were conveying in that?
Well, the first thing I say, it could be a good sleep aid on a long flight across the ocean.
Yeah, well,
You'll get lots of sleep. It's a race. The publisher wanted to make it a lesson on business lessons disguised as an autobiography. Mm-hmm. I think it was kind of reverse. It was an autobiography disguised as a business lesson. So it's a little bit about my experiences, but I try to say what some of the mistakes were and learn from those mistakes. And it's really more of a ride. I wouldn't say nowadays, as you know, because you're an author, you can't publish a book nowadays, it seems, without having this single theme, single lesson that's going to catch everyone's attention.
Yeah.
That was not necessarily what makes business rock. Yeah. Except for maybe developing a global business and how to do a global business and don't make the same mistakes that I did. But the necessity for a business needs to be more than one domestic market. So that would probably come the closest. But then in there, I have all sorts of lessons of life, particularly the advice I give is young kids, because we worked a lot with kids being MTV.
And far from being, I mean, I think your comment about it being a great take along on a long flight, Bill, I mean, I'm sure with your incredible stories, it would have been a very positive distraction on a long flight. And I'm sure a number of lessons learned. Can you take us back to a particular moment, particularly with MTV Europe? I mean, where you've had a remarkable career building this global operation. As you mentioned, 2 billion audience, 200 channels, 200 countries. Can you take us back to a particular moment or an event that was difficult on that journey from a business point of view? Paint the picture. What was that moment? What was a really tough event during that process?
Everybody thinks MTV is like a candy store, right? It's not true. It's very difficult to build a global business from scratch around the world with different regulations, different cultures, different languages, everything. The key, I think, as I look back on it, well, I had three strategies, three parts to the strategy. Number one was scale again and access, which means distribution. I, again, had a mantra, which was aggressive, creative, relentless. I simply wanted to be in every household in the world. Secondly, was design a product, and this was quite radical at the time, that truly reflected and respected local cultures. So our channel was dramatically different wherever you went around the world. We had marching bands in China, we had Bollywood in India, we had Dora with a burqa in the Middle East, the list goes on. And then thirdly, because we were dealing with so many stakeholders who resisted us, do something good. And this is what I was addressing a bit earlier. We were engaged in many voting campaigns, for example. We had a whole host of issues. The one that we really jumped on because it coincided with our audience was AIDS, HIV. The reason it coincided is because the most heavily impacted demo was the same as our audience. So, so that takes us to, many pivotal points. Just on the AIDS side, in 1998, it was out of control. Over 2 million people were dying. Many more were being infected. There was no cure, very little treatment available, if at all. And there was a lot of hopelessness, really.
Yeah. And
we had all sorts of counter observations on why would MTV do this. But we went all in. We started with 30-second PSAs, and then we went to 90-minute documentaries, and then we made it seamless in our programming. And again, there was some resistance to that, not from the audience, but from some governments, because our programming became very explicit on prevention measures, even internally, because it wasn't profit-driven necessarily. So we had to fight through a lot of resistance. It just kept plugging away. It didn't happen overnight. Eventually, we became the largest multimedia effort to fight the pandemic. Another one, it was very hard to show. Thank you for saying that, but it was very hard to show measurement. As you know, behavioral change is very hard to prove. Well, we researched. I'll give you one example. We would have screenings impactful screening, stories, which you like. That's how you tell your message. You like
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah.
So we make programs that you'd want to watch, actually, just, because they were entertaining, but they had all sorts of AIDS messages built in. So we would do screenings, and perhaps one message was testing, how critical it was to get testing, because then you could have access to treatment. So right next door to the screening, we would have a center to get tested. So as you saw people leave the theater or whatever, a good number of them would then go right over to confidential testing, because, as you know, there was quite a bit of discrimination and stigma.
And stigma attached, yeah. Yeah.
So that gave us an immediate measurement, immediate. And then we also had WHO and the World Bank do all sorts of research to show that you could have behavioral change. You're more likely that if you watch the program, have a condom, you're more likely to, be tested, as I was saying. You're less likely to discriminate against others, even in your own family. So the list went on and on and on. It's not easy to measure behavioral change, but it's something to work very hard at.
Yeah.
And that example, if you want, if it's a separate completely, was our Berlin involvement, and the involvement in leading up to November 9th, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were very active in getting distribution behind the Iron Curtain, starting in January. Went on a satellite that cost a lot of money. There was resistance back in the headquarters. It was $10 million for one transponder. And then we flicked a switch so it was not encrypted. So everyone could buy a dish, a 90-centimeter dish. Before it was a 3-meter dish, and you had access to this programming. So lo and behold, behind the Iron Curtain, we had people sending home for money, relatives in the West, whatever, to get enough money to buy a dish to suddenly have access to programming. In this case, was MTV. At one point, we had nearly equal, in some countries even more, distribution than we had in the West, because they were so eager to learn. So coincidentally, we didn't bring the wall down, believe me, but although we were told we did, we brought MTV to all these countries in 1989. Sequentially, the governments changed, and then leading up to November 9th, the Berlin Wall coming down. I was in East Berlin at the time. And we developed a relationship with Gorbachev. We gave him awards, because that then led into the Soviet Union in 1991. And that was a challenge, because there was not money to profits. It was not commercially viable to invest in countries behind the Iron Curtain. But we did it because we knew we could be part of something big, a change.
Yes.
But again, to your point, it was a pivot that wasn't necessarily popular at the time.
So, Bill, is there a particular example that you recall of great resistance, whether it be from the board or, executives or whoever? Is there a particular moment that you can recall where it was really tough, and take us through how you pivoted out of that and got to the other side to get people's support?
So anytime you want to take a chunk of money, and as I was saying earlier, the transfer back in '89 cost $10 million, you get resistance. So you really have to go forward. I'm thinking about when I launched MTV Pakistan, and I'll never forget, because my own staff didn't want me to do it. It was like not only dangerous, but there was absolutely no commercial benefit at all.
Yeah.
But this was around 2005, I believe. And things were tense with Pakistan. Daniel Pearl just lost his life, a journalist from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And it was not particularly friendly between Pakistan and many countries in the West. Yeah. I had an opportunity, one of my brilliant staffers on the distribution side found a way to get MTV into Pakistan, all localized, by the way, local music, etc. And there was a lot of trepidation, and I didn't actually tell anybody. I didn't tell headquarters. I didn't tell the press. I packed my bags and I went to Karachi, and we launched MTV Pakistan. So it was a bit of a leap in faith. And I'll just say one other thing. There's a song, I Want My MTV, Dire Straits. Yeah. I'll never forget it. After giving my typical rah-rah speech on the stage, about how MTV Pakistan was going to be the best MTV in the world, the audience actually on their own broke out to "I Want My MTV" as I was walking off the stage.
Wow.
It was probably
What
the
a
warmest
moment.
reception, ironically, that I've had with any country around the world.
Why did you not tell people?
Well, because I knew I would be told no.
Interesting point.
Yeah.
And so what was the strategy then to get past the point of no to yes?
Do it.
Do it.
Yeah. You know, we had a phrase, I'm sure you've heard this before. It's easier to say I'm sorry than ask for permission.
Yeah.
You know, I think my own staff sometimes didn't like that idea. And another gospel that I kept repeating over and over and over: break the rules, break the rules. To never accept no for an answer. I would always quote Churchill: never, 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 never say no. I would have added a few more nevers in that speech, but basically the premise was the same. So occasionally you just got to do it.
You know, again, that's a fine point, and never say no and break the rules. But we're also living in times where so many rules are being broken. So in navigating that strategy, are there some caveats or qualifiers around that? I mean, you know, when you broke the rules, what was your strategy and end game?
Well, the end game is to get something done, because you're always encountering, particularly as an entrepreneur, a no constantly.
Yeah.
No, you can't do this. No, that there's a problem there. And so you just are trying to cut through the bureaucracy, because bureaucracy can be a killer to any business, and particularly a creative business. But when I was commanding nuclear missile bases, I definitely didn't want to say to anybody, break the rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of depends on the product and what the circumstances are. But yes, there are definitely guardrails against.
Yeah. And clearly you had a clear strategy that it would be successful and it would contribute to the ultimate business performance in the end.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. I mean, MTV's at the time was a phenomenon. And yes, we were very profitable as we went on, particularly in the US. It was very profitable. But MTV had a chance to have change because we were so influential. And it was quite something that you could have this influence over so many people. So that definitely weighed heavily in our minds, that we were part of a phenomenon that never existed before, and we were just going with it. And the morale was very high in our staff because we knew we were bringing change to countries that had never seen MTV before.
So, you know, in many ways, I mean, that sounds like you were really motivated by a much higher purpose, which had the business payback was in perhaps staff morality, productivity. I mean, were you conscious of what the bigger purpose was in terms of explicitly defining it for your people?
Absolutely, totally, very much so. That's exactly the point. But again, you have to remember you're working for a profit and loss stakeholder, shareholder, public company.
Yeah.
So you have to navigate that. But the example going back to Eastern Europe, because in my prior, one of my prior careers, I was part of NATO and I had missiles. I was in charge of missiles. So the irony of suddenly, and I'll give a direct quote, Gorbachev in our various meetings, we'd give him awards, used to call me Missile Man. And he had a great quote, and it's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but he was saying music is more powerful than missiles. In my courtyard, I have a section of the Berlin Wall, 3.5 ton section with this inscription on it, Gorbachev, saying music is more powerful than missiles. So absolutely we had so because of my background, it was a bit unusual, very unusual. And the irony of bringing a different army, a powerful army of music, whereas once before I had missiles, that's definitely fits that higher purpose. But now I'm going to quickly say something. This is very important.
Yes.
Take yourself too seriously. At MTV, I kept telling myself, do not believe what you read in the newspapers. It's entertainment. It's lifting the spirit. Yes, we had important conscientious programming like countering the AIDS pandemic, But in this regard especially, and I think in life in general, you cannot take yourself too seriously.
That's a very important point. And yeah, in the relative big picture, I think sometimes, as you say, we forget our frailty and our humanity, And how did you inculcate that in the business? I mean, not taking oneself too seriously and having more of that, the lighter side, the lighter moments. How was that inculcated in the culture?
Yeah, not so much about the business, but definitely the culture. And the culture is, you're absolutely right. Humility rules over hubris. And we see so much hubris.
Yeah.
And we saw a lot back then, look at the 80s, it was all about hubris. So it's very important in the culture to have a humble and have humility. There's no shortage. There's no second choice. You have to be humble. And particularly when you're in different cultures around the world. And no one culture is better than the other. No one country is better than the other.
Yeah.
To be humble and quick to say sorry. I had some, again, principles coming from the military. First on the battlefield, last to leave, meaning with a global operation, you have a crisis invariably somewhere in the world. And it's very important to be on location. Yes. And not let your lieutenants or your team commanders or your local CEOs be all alone. Be there with them, arm in arm. And the other one, which is a bit foreign to businesses, honestly, we all have to remind ourselves: quick to take blame, slow to take credit. And that's part of the humility as well. We all make mistakes. We all learn from each other. Yeah. And this is very important.
Bill, I mean, it strikes me, you talk about those values. I'm curious about your young life. And, is there a defining moment in your young life? Not everybody grows up with that kind of mindset or value system. Share a little more about your childhood, what shaped you, and is there a particular life-defining moment?
Yeah, I had a very strong mother. In my second book, I wrote a chapter, it's on my website, about my mother. And like many people, particularly those with single moms, they truly, truly appreciate their mom, their mother, because no one works harder than a single mom, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was a defining principle in my life, just seeing how hard she worked in job after job, selling real estate, crossing swamplands of Florida in new housing developments. Or another career she had was the receptionist in an emergency room in a hospital, which taught me a little bit about global health. Another one is she was the rental car check-in person at the airport before you had a separate location. So you had, in the heat of Miami, right where all the cars are driving by you, the gas fumes, she worked this little cubicle outside, not inside air conditioning. And just to make ends meet, and I would see her count the pennies. So I think that was a defining part of my growing up. The other part was television. Why did I love television so much?
Yeah.
We had a lot of challenges coming from a broken family. And I can remember on Sunday nights, my grandmother, who was the matriarch really of the family, and she was a widow. We didn't have any male figures in our immediate circle. My mother and my sister and my aunt, all women. Well, I have 6 sisters if you count all the step and half sisters. Anyway, we're watching TV every Sunday night. It was the only time that I saw the family laugh. And as a young kid, you're watching this, you're saying, wow, that little box is very powerful. And I think that had an influence on me. I also memorized the TV Guide. I was a television junkie. It's the only thing that I could make my mother proud of, because my grades weren't particularly good, but I could recite the entire week of a TV Guide. So, I saw where all these things related to television provided happiness and were capable of great influence. So I think that was another pivotal point in my childhood.
Yeah, and interesting that your mother also works in the emergency room, and how you've kind of brought this intersection of the media world and, your various initiatives as global ambassador and founder of chair of COVAX, and doing these remarkable international health initiatives around the world, not only with HIV, but also with the COVID pandemic and distributing vaccines. What for you is important in terms of the relationship between media and these big global social impact initiatives, whether it be, Gavi and vaccinating 700 million children, or whether it be COVAX and distributing the vaccine worldwide?
Well, it's indispensable. And of course, now I had the privilege, I guess, or the challenge of going through many disruptions of television.
Yeah.
When I was small, there was like 2 or 3 channels, and then you had disruption from cable TV. And now you have the disruption of streaming TV. So there's many different ways to have content. It's not necessarily through a television box. And then, of course, the extension of that is all the things we do online, including social media. And the answer, I believe, to the question is unlimited influence, unlimited benefit to whatever the cause is. Unfortunately, it's also given an opportunity to what we now call fake news or disinformation. We're seeing that out of control in the Ukraine situation. So how do you determine what's true and what's not? And it's getting more and more difficult because you can fake things now using artificial intelligence and even on the visual side. And that creates, unfortunately, opportunity for a lot of different disinformation. I see it with my own children. They come to me with something that I know is not true. They're convinced it's true. And so the answer, I suppose, is just education. And I'm not sure it's regulation, but in some ways, perhaps on the social media side, there is some regulation to comes into play. But I think more importantly than the negative is the positive, because it can definitely impact not only just awareness and education, but also values, core values.
And core values expressed through the media.
Now, that's not universal, of course. As someone said a long time ago, television is a vast wasteland. Who was that? I can't remember his name, sorry. There is a lot of television out there, let's just face it, it's just a guilty pleasure. Yeah, but the opportunity is quite big. And again, when I say television, I mean content in many different vehicles.
So turning slightly to somebody that we both admire and love and respect, Nelson Mandela. I know that the late and great Kofi Annan actually appointed you as the first envoy of AIDS at the UN. And of course, Kofi Annan too was very close to Mandela. What is a particular moment that you recall, Bill, where, Mandela, his life, his leadership, his legacy had an indelible impact on you? Can you take us back in time?
No, another good question. There's several. I'll pick one, perhaps. We decided to do a show with Nelson Mandela called Meeting Mandela.
Yeah.
And we were a little late in developing a channel specifically for Africa. We were bringing MTV Europe down, but he actually launched MTV Africa for us the year after we did a show called Meeting Mandela. And Meeting Mandela was a thrill for all of us. We had a small production staff in the Hotel Saxon in Johannesburg.
Yeah, Johannesburg.
Which is where he went as soon as he was released to write his autobiography. If you remember, I think he lived there for 6 months. So we brought him back there and we set up camp there for 2 weeks to produce a show called Meeting Mandela. And what we wanted to do was, we knew already, who didn't, even 2005, about Mandela's wonderful brand and courage and set of values that were going to live long after he was on this earth. So we wanted to do something to our MTV audience. The challenge was bridging the multi-generation gap. And Mandela had a very thick accent. We also had Bishop Tutu, Tutu was actually more articulate than Mandela. But Mandela had these invaluable lessons of life. So instead of using a professional interviewer or narrator, we decided to go to our audience. And we picked someone from Uganda, from Burma, and then a person from Israel and Palestine, the Palestinian state. We had those people talk to Mandela about what they have experienced in life. One was hopelessness, the AIDS epidemic. That was the person from Uganda. His name is Henry Hudson. He lost his father and brother to AIDS. So we talked to Mandela about how do you overcome hopelessness. And then we had Min Zin from Burma, who was a freedom fighter at the time. He had to leave his family in order to keep being an activist. How do you leave your family? And Mandela talked to him about how he was in prison. When his mother died, they didn't allow him to go to a funeral. And also his son, when his son died.
Yeah.
So he talked to Mandela about sacrifice. What really drove it home was forgiveness. So we had an Israeli who lost his sister from the first female suicide bomber. And we had a Palestinian who lost her father, civilian, not in the military, to an Israeli sniper. So they obviously had terrible, terrible anger toward each other.
Yes.
And we had Mandela talk to them about forgiveness. And in the end, so this all was edited down to an hour-long show. It was very influential, not only for us, but also for all of our AIDS programming, we did something unusual. We put it on MTV, of course, all the MTV channels around the world and our extended brands, but we also gave it free, rights free to anybody who would run it. So even to this day, the programming that we have as part of Staying Alive, which was the initiative that we started back in the 90s, is offered to a network that even doubles what the MTV network is, a series of TV channels, and we give it to everybody free. So a lot of this programming gets incredible coverage. So the Meeting Mandela one was not only very moving for us, but we think impactful for the audience.
Meeting him, and not only behind the cameras but in person. Whoa. How did you feel at the time?
So it's very interesting. I was wheeled into a private room with him in the Saxton. I don't know if you've been in the Saxton.
I have, yeah.
There's that little cigar room, little library. It's tiny little room.
Yeah.
And I found myself there one-on-one with him, with nobody else. It was extraordinary. And he went through the history, really, and talked about how close things were to a lot of violence. And I quickly learned, I mean, the one story he told me, I think it's in his book as well, where he was put under terrible conditions and working on these outdoor mines and wasn't allowed to wear sunglasses, so his eyes were permanently damaged.
Yeah.
The guards wouldn't let him, as I said earlier, attend the funerals of his mother and his son. Some of the first people he invited to his inauguration to the president were those same prison guards.
Yes.
And so you quickly, as he's telling these stories, became overwhelmed really about his power of forgiveness, which is really his whole brand, I think. The power of forgiveness is the number of all the things he contributes to the world in lessons. That's number one.
So on that note, Bill, do you think Mandela's leadership example is relevant for the world today? And if so, why?
Well, it definitely is. But unfortunately, the realism that exists now doesn't allow for a step back in compassion. But if you just pick this major crisis that we're all living through in Ukraine, there's no diplomacy going on. It's all about military exploits on one side. The atrocities are just unspeakable. And the number of displaced people and the new people that are suffering, up to 10 million, is going to have a long-term effect on not only Ukraine, but also Europe. The Ukrainians rightfully are outraged at the level of atrocities, and it's very hard to come to the table with that. On the flip side, Russia has put so much into this, Putin specifically, that it's very hard to come to any sort of peace agreement or a diplomatic effort because they put so much into it.
So, Bill, Mandela's brand of leadership, to what extent is it relevant in this world today?
Yeah, I think it's more relevant than ever because of the amount of violence. There's so much autocracy versus democracy, poverty, hunger. I mean, we have more challenges than probably in recorded history in some ways. And a person that stands above it all and creates this aura of forgiveness, which again, I think is his most important aura, really most important message to people, is more critical than ever. Now, whether it's applicable or relevant in certain situations is a challenge, obviously.
Yeah.
I think you have a greater opportunity when you go more local. I have seen in my life so many examples of unselfish giving and help, particularly in global health, but everywhere. I just went to a event to benefit the refugees from, again, the situation in Ukraine, and learned that there are so many efforts that we don't even know about in Ukraine that are helping. Food shortages, water shortages, medical supplies. And I think there's a lot happening that we don't know about. Rather than look for one Uber figure around the world, it's, in my view, more about instilling values like Mandela's values in an army of people that are doing it, NGOs and people just doing it on the side. It's really quite extraordinary.
Well, to your point, I mean, if we could build an army of 1 million Mandela generals around the world, you know, and there are so many doing it. And I think that profiling those kinds of people and also acknowledging and rewarding those kinds of people, you know, gets more of that message out there. It's, but, you know, as you say, in terms of his example, I was wondering in him sharing in those interviews, particularly with the Israeli and Palestinian example you gave, what stood out for you, Bill, in Mandela's response to each of those people both suffering pain and loss in the same conflict?
So I always look for impact. And again, it's sometimes impossible, if not very hard, to measure behavioral change through the airwaves.
Yeah.
But the one thing that did it for me with the Israeli and the Palestinian is they absolutely hated each other when they met. And they didn't, we couldn't even put them in the same room with Mandela. We had to interview him separately.
Yeah.
But we spent like 10, 12 days together. And at the end, they were actually going shopping together.
Wow.
At the mall. And the subtext was, well, if they can do it, why can't the leaders do it?
Yeah. Well, maybe they are the leaders. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just turning to some fun facts, Bill. What made you buy a home that was a church?
Well, I love open spaces, number one, and we like to bring many different types of people into space. I mean, the joke is in a sign of diversity, we've included every religion with synagogue windows and a prayer rug facing Mecca and Shiva and Ganesh as you walk in. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Of course, we got Buddha up here.
Yes.
And so I like to say it's a celebration of diversity. My wife, I say inclusion is what we're all about. And she says, no, it's about confusion. You're confusing the kids. So I don't know. I guess it goes both ways. But we like the church. We've been here for over 20 years.
Yeah. What is something in your young life that you're most proud of?
Well, I joke with the kids. It's nothing that makes other people good, better. I was naive and I was just trying to survive, I suppose, as a young kid. But I didn't have any athletic ability. I didn't have particular academic ability. I had no ability.
That's not true.
No, I think it is true. Anyway, I told my kids, because I'm really old fashioned, I say you can do a lot with work, hard work. Still, I think still trumps everything else, talent and everything else. I know it's an old fashioned thing. And so I wasn't good enough for the tennis team. I wasn't good at football, whatever. So track was my thing. So I ran like Forrest Gump. I still do, by the way. Parts of my body have given out. And I actually was on a relay team that got fourth in state. And so I always remind the kids, the slowest guy in the world got fourth in state. And so it's a running joke with us. It's nothing, to be particularly proud about, except I think it amplifies that with hard work, you can do a lot. And by the way, fourth doesn't get you on the podium, but I was quite happy to get fourth.
There's an incredible resilience and hard work and discipline that comes with that too.
And I'll quickly say the other thing was, I worked when I was 10 years old, delivering papers, selling papers on the street corner, selling yellow pages. And I try and teach the kids just a little bit of work can make a big difference.
So that was instilled at a very young age.
Yes.
And the third question, I mean, I know you moved across the Atlantic Oceans from the United States of America to the UK, but you've been in the UK a long time. What embedded you in the UK and London? Why Why did you not return?
Well, that's a good question too. I still ask myself that. My personality is I tend to go vertical. So, for example, when I went to Italy in the army, this is back a few years ago. I stayed for 4 years, never went back to the States once. That's just me, vertical. So I didn't plan on staying here this long. But I'm married European. I have a very strong wife who's half German, half Austrian, and she has raised this most amazing set of children that have 3 passports. So I like the international part. Also, even when I left media with the global health work because of Geneva, and I still do some work in Asia as well, so it's easier from London. London's actually a great city. It's been up and down. It's had lots of challenges, still does, but no, we feel quite at home here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Just moving slightly back to your development side of your life, Bill. With COVID, you've been very involved in Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Immunization, and of course, COVAX, the distribution of the vaccine. What is the key part of that global initiative that gives you most hope for vaccinating the world against COVID?
Well, we all know about the COVID vaccines. I mean, in 2020, things were pretty dismal.
Yeah.
In January of 21, we had hope, and look what happened. It brought us back, the vaccine. There's always some pushback on vaccines, and there's anti-vaxxers, and there's, never unanimity on anything, but I'm like totally in on vaccines. The other thing about vaccines and what we did at Gavi, and still doing with Gavi, we are at the stage now where we've done billions of vaccines, hundreds of millions of children. This is pre-COVID, hundreds of millions of children vaccinated, tens of millions of lives saved. So this gets back to a principle that I totally believe in, which is scale and impact. And I think that's part of the Bill Gates dream, really, when he started it. And the other good news is vaccines are developing all the time. More and more diseases will be found to be prevented. And then, yes, COVID, and then, of course, we managed COVAX, happened out of the clear blue sky. And there was a lot of challenges there. I'm sure you read about some of them. There was vaccine hoarding, vaccine nationalism. There weren't enough vaccines available.
Sure.
And the whole thing about Gavi, again, one of the original principles started by Bill Gates, still Bill and Melinda Gates, was equitable distribution of vaccines. So we targeted the 71 LICs, lower income, and then also some of the middle income, just to make sure there was no lag time. Because before there could be a lag time of years after a vaccine was developed between the developed world and the lesser developed world. So this was a very important concept. However, in COVID, we still had this disparity. Why? Because countries it wasn't really the best example of multilateralism. And it strikes a little bit of fear if you're worried about how we're going to solve climate change, because we need the world to work together.
Sure.
So the initial aspect. Now, the good news about COVID is that there have been so many vaccines developed now around the world. That there are actually enough vaccines, believe it or not. But we need to get the uptake better because there's now some complacency. And as we know, I'm sure you've heard this a lot, that no one's safe until everyone's safe, because as the virus goes from country to country, and more importantly, the variants are always going to be there. So we have to continue to work to get everybody vaccinated.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And of course, these subvariants are coming out all the time. So our work is not yet done. No. But in our final moments, Bill, any sort of final message you have for current and aspiring leaders in the world, either from your leadership experience or any final message of what you think Nelson Mandela would say to the world today?
Well, keep hope alive, for sure. I think another pivotal moment for me, I can't remember exactly what year it was. I think it might have been 60. It was right before the moon landing, when the first picture was taken. No, it was from an orbit around the moon. It was a trial before they landed. And there was not any film left in the camera except for one shot or something. And forgive me, I forget the astronaut's name. Took the picture of Earth. First time it's ever been seen. in all the blackness, you saw this beautiful blue. And of course, you probably have heard of the little small documentary called The Blue Dot. We are a blue dot. We are a blue dot. And it's remarkable that we forget that we live on this precious, we're talking about going to Mars. Would you like to live on Mars?
That's your new forwarding address.
I mean, it's important to continue exploration, like, we didn't always in our history, but we have to do everything we can to protect this blue dot. And there's so many challenges. It's not only pandemics, it's war, it's climate, it's economic disparity. And it's imperative that we just work together, join arm in arm, hand together, think about the big picture, think about the blue dot.
Bill Roedy, on that note, you are a fine ambassador, and just thank you for your dedication. I'm adding a fourth D, but for your dedication, not only defense, diplomacy, and development, but for your incredible dedication and hard work. Thank you so much. And inwards, onwards, and upwards, as we say.
Not at all. Good to be here, Anne. And right back to you, by the way. You're doing great work as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Speaking with Bill Roedy was such a joy, and I'm so struck by his unapologetic humility. In a corporate age where there is so much pressure on being right, on being perfect, a corporate culture that permeates so many organizations of blaming, naming, and shaming. And yet Bill is the antithesis of that. He is such a humble man, and it was a critical ingredient in how he built a global business, an exciting global business like MTV, building an audience of 2 billion with 200 channels across 200 countries. It required his humility to navigate across different cultures without a sense of superiority or a sense of inferiority. In an age where we are dealing with cultural issues, and how do we connect with these cultures? How do we present ourselves in these different cultures? And how do we view these different cultures? The second thing that stood out was his reference to the late president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who passed on August the 30th, 2022, and had ruled the Soviet Union between 1985 and 1991. And Gorbachev called Bill the Missile Man. More striking was his quote that music is more powerful than missiles. Music is more powerful than missiles. It reminds me of another quote by William Shakespeare, who said, "If music be the food of love, play on." And what strikes me is this incredible missed opportunity for all of us in different sectors to bring music into our working lives in a much more powerful and persuasive way, whether it be in our hospitals, our classrooms, our congress halls, and our boardrooms. We are undervaluing, underappreciating, and underutilizing the powerful asset of music. And finally, I'm struck by Bill's 3Ds: discipline, diplomacy, and development. Listening to Bill, talking to Bill, looking at his remarkable life and the work he continues to do in the world, living by this philosophy of do well and do good, there is a remarkable fourth D: dedication. So until next time, thank you for being with us. Please sign up, share with your friends, and take care and take thoughtful, bold action. Just one bold step for you, but together, one giant step for humanity. I'm Anne Pratt. This is Leading Boldly into the Future. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon. Share with your friends. Sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.